Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. David Moore Robinson lives in Alexandria, Virginia, with his wife and their two vociferous but well-meaning Jack Russell Terriers. Most mornings, he can be found sliding backward on his rear end, rowing up and down the Potomac with his teammates. David holds a bachelor's in English from the University of Notre Dame, a master's in teaching from the Columbia Teachers College, and Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Colorado State University. David is the author of My Unremarkable Brain, a fat-fueled adventure into the world of epilepsy and the ketogenic diet, a hilarious and inspiring book where David, a serial dieter and middle-aged fathlete, takes readers on a ride into the strange and surprising world of American health culture. At the age of 40, after living for over a decade with epilepsy, David decided to put his brain to the task of figuring out the best way to eat and live. What he discovered was a community of medical experts, thought leaders, and regular folks gathered around the ketogenic diet, a much-reviled fad diet that is, in fact, a proven 100-year-old medical treatment for epilepsy and other brain disorders. You can find David on Instagram at @DRobinsonWrites. David Robinson, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
The honor's all mine, my friend. Thank you for having me, Casey. I appreciate it.
It's such an honor to host you. Like I said, I'm really glad I got the right introduction. I was almost prepared to talk about your career with the San Antonio Spurs, your two Olympic appearances, the original Dream Team, a few championships. You are, in fact, not 7'1", and you have not played pro basketball. So
that's correct. That's correct. I'm a mere 6'4", just a shrimpy little guy.
That's pretty close.
Although I met him once, and his chin is right about my forehead. I have a picture of us standing next to each other, and it's just incredible.
That's awesome. I love that. My dad does sports here in the Salt Lake Valley, and so he's been able to talk with a lot of those guys, and so it's funny to watch him when I try to interview some of these centers, and he's as tall as I am, like 5'8", and so I pretty much have a sore shoulder interviewing a lot of these people.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
I love the way you approach writing your book. I really enjoyed reading. I'm through a few chapters. I really enjoyed kind of reading it, and the way you approached it. You talk in the very beginning about what this book is not, which I actually really appreciated that part as well. Can you explain to the reader in what scenario would possibly exist that being told that you have an unremarkable brain is actually a very, very good thing?
Oh yeah. Yeah, so that's where I got the title. And I said there's a story behind that. So at this point I had been living with epilepsy for a while, and had a long time seizure free, but had a couple of seizures, and the doctor sent me for an MRI. In fact, I had to ask for the MRI. That's a whole other story. But he said, you're fine. And I said, you sure? And a friend of mine who's a neurologist sort of pushed me a little bit. I didn't know at the time that my friend was worried that I might have a brain tumor, which if I had known that, I would have pushed a little bit harder, probably. But anyway, so I got the MRI, and the radiologist is like, I said to the radiologist, okay, you see anything? He's like, well, your doctor will call you with the results, right? And this was, in fairness, it was like the Friday before Christmas or something like that. It was kind of weird time of year, but I'm sitting there waiting to hear, kind of, I wonder what's going on with that. And then a week or so later, I never did hear from my doctor, by the way. This is the same one who said, don't worry about it, who I eventually moved on from. But finally I got something in the mail, and it was the actual report from the MRI. And I'm looking at it. I can't read this thing. It's a bunch of letters and numbers and words that I don't understand, and left hemisphere, blah, blah, blah. But the very bottom was a diagnosis, an unremarkable brain. And I said, yeah, it sounds, I think my high school teachers would be on board with that, with that description. Not exactly the straight A student, but what it really means is that there's nothing to be remarked on, right? There's no lesions or tumors or anything negative going on. So it's one of those funny upside down, medical terms, where the test comes out negative, it's actually a good thing, right? That,
right.
There's nothing to be found there. But the reason I titled my book after that was that it was kind of a moment for me where there was almost something empowering about having that information in my hands and knowing something about what's going on. And it kind of, it's sort of symbolic of this whole journey that I've been on, of learning about diet and learning about how diet can affect health, and how, how specifically my diet can actually affect my brain health. It's something that never even would have occurred to me, before. And so, yeah, that's kind of why I included it. It is a funny story, but it's also, sort of this emblematic moment in the journey that I've been on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a great title. It's a really great title.
Thanks.
Like I said, if somebody just stopped you on the side of the street and said, "Hey, you've got an unremarkable brain," be like, thanks. But in that context, very, very helpful.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's go back and tell the full story. I appreciate kind of skipping ahead to that. I thought that was really funny. But yeah, so our mutual friend Maggie Stewart recommended that we get you on the show, and when she recommends somebody, we don't need to vet them out at all. I'm automatically just right, with their email, just going to reach out as soon as possible. So listening to you on her podcast Off the Couch was really great. But let's hear your story into health. This wasn't something you were seeking out, and your diagnosis of epilepsy was actually kind of interesting, much later than I would have guessed.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, and the book, and thanks for the compliments on the book, because it's kind of it's a weird little book, right? It has these sort of different strands. I didn't find the ketogenic diet for epilepsy, actually. I was looking for a weight loss diet, right?
Right.
And as I tell, my first section is sort of about that journey. I call it Fat on the Body, right? And how I sort of, I was an athlete in college. I was a rower, and I was on the rowing team and everything, and so I was in really good shape and all that sort of thing. But time goes by, right? And by the time I was 39, I had I had developed a bit of a belly. I put on a little more. I was carrying quite a lot of weight, actually, probably about 50 pounds overweight. And I actually discovered a local rowing club, masters rowing club, for people of my age, and got back into that. And that was kind of fun. But I was also looking for, how should I eat? So I tried Weight Watchers, the typical story, right? I tried Weight Watchers. I tried, this diet, that diet. And I was always sort of in the neighborhood of low carb, but I was always skeptical about low carb diets, because I thought, well, of course, if you cut out a third of food, you're just cutting calories, right? It's just another way of cutting calories. And so I was trying like clean eating, the wild diet, Abel James, so all these sort of low carb adjacent things, right? And then one day I was listening to a podcast, and that's the other thing. At the same time, I had taken a job. I had gone from teaching in front of the classroom to a more of an administrative, more of a desk job, and I had a longer commute. So I discovered podcasts and started getting into, let me listen to this person, listen to that person. And so anyway, one day I was listening to the Model Health Show. I don't know if you know that one, but the
Stevenson?
guest, Stevens, yeah, Sean Stevenson. That's
Sean
it.
Stevenson.
Yeah. And that's a really great show too. And I heard Vinny Tortorich. I don't know if you've had Vinny on the show, but he's a funny guy and an engaging guy. And I thought, and he talked about NSNG, like no sugars, no grains. Thought, well, that's pretty interesting. That seems doable versus, this whole big thing. Little did I realize at the time that's about 80% of the food in the supermarket has some kind of sugars or some kind of grains, So I started kind of listening a little bit, kind of interested. And then what really convinced me was that he would have what he called the luminaries. He had Gary Taubes on there. So I'd listen to, oh, wow, so much interesting stuff to say. So I'd run off and read Gary Taubes' book, and then a few weeks later he'd have Nina Teicholz, and I read her book, and, just so many great thinkers. And it just, it starts to build up, like you can't unsee it, right? Once you start to kind of understand how much sense it makes, right? So I was in the phase of starting to get into the low carb diet and starting to see some success with it and drop a few pounds. I would say I was sort of dabbling, maybe on again, off again, right? A little bit. But there was one day that he had Jim Abrams on as a guest. I don't know if you're familiar with Jim Abrams, but he's a big time Hollywood producer. He made the Airplane movies, the really hilarious and really dopey movies from my childhood,
So good.
Yeah. And so he was a guest, and he was talking about his son, Charlie, who when Charlie was a year and a half old, he started having seizures. And they went through every possible therapy known to man. They went through every medication. He had an operation on his brain. They were getting ready to do a second operation on his brain, which would basically as Jim said, it would have led to what they call quote unquote progressive retardation throughout the rest of his life, right? I mean, basically would have made him a vegetable, right? Eventually. And so Jim was starting to look. Jim was in one night. He says he was in the library of the UCLA Medical Center, and he was looking up, he's looking up epilepsy and this, and going through the what do you call the index, and he sees a reference to ketogenic diet. What the heck is that? So he starts looking it up and sees that there's this diet that they can use for epilepsy. Brings it up to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Yeah, we don't really do that anymore." Why not? So rather than go through this operation, he seeks out and finds a guy named Dr. John Freeman, who's at the time the only medical practitioner in the country who still administers the ketogenic diet for epilepsy.
Wow.
Now, again, he's a very wealthy Hollywood producer, so he has access to and then the means to be able to fly across the country, to Baltimore and take his kid to the doctor. And he said, sure enough, within weeks, he was going from dozens of seizures a day down to none completely, right? And after 2 years on the diet, they tried weaning him off. He started having seizures again, so they did another 2 years, weaned him off, and he had basically outgrown the epilepsy. It was gone. And Charlie's an adult today. He actually, he's a school teacher himself, and he does videos online, and he's part of this foundation which Jim began. So as soon as he said, nobody should have to go through this experience that I did. And so he and his wife, Nancy, started this the Charlie Foundation, named after his son. And so they have been actually the driving force in the ketogenic diet for epilepsy ever since the early 90s when they formed that. So anyway, so I heard all, from my standpoint, I heard this and it was just like, wow, this is incredible. The first time I had ever thought that, what I eat might affect what's going on in my brain,
Yeah.
To quote Georgia Eade, she says, believe it or not, science shows that the brain is part of the body, right? And
it is confirmed. We have confirmed that.
we have now confirmed that, yes. And so I was like, wow, that's really interesting, but again, so by this time, I had my medication pretty well tuned in, right? I had been about 10 years seizure free. I wake up in the morning, take a pill, take one at night again, kind of not think about it, and so I was like, yeah, okay, interesting. I could look into this, but why rock the boat kind of thing, kind of just tucked it in the back of my mind, I guess. And then it was a few months after that I had gone on a trip. I had gone camping with my brother up in upstate New York, and was driving back here to Alexandria where I live, and it's a good 8-hour drive. So a pretty intense weekend. Get up there, we're sleeping rough, we're having a couple of beers, whatever. And about halfway through the trip, and somewhere in Pennsylvania, I started to have what they call an aura. Now, for me, an aura, everyone's different. Some people will see things, or bright lights, or headache, or tingling. For me, it actually starts in the auditory center of my brain, and so I hear things. Basically, is the best way to put it. My very first seizure was, I heard, I was having a conversation with some friends, and all of a sudden, it sounded like, you ever take like a cardboard tube and stick it on your ear, and it sounds like people are echoing at the end of a tunnel or something like that.
Yeah.
That's what it started sounding like to me, and I kind of felt like tingly and floating a little bit. This particular time, I was driving my car, and I had the radio on, but then I heard another song over top of it, like this musical tune, and I was like, where is that coming from?
Interesting.
And I turned off the radio, and it's still going on, and I was like, oh my God, uh-oh. And I'm on a highway, right? And so I started to pull over to the side, and that's the last thing I remember. Apparently the car had taken a left turn across 2 lanes of traffic, a big grassy median, 2 more lanes of traffic, and up an embankment right near an overpass. So it was a pretty close call. Yeah. And it was my wife was at home at the time, and she gets a call from, is this the wife of David Robinson? She said, yeah, your husband's been in an accident. What happened? Is he okay? Well, he's been in an accident. You need to come to this hospital and come get him. Okay. Um, Now, as it happens, my wife doesn't drive. So she calls up her best friends and says, "Hey, can you guys go with me to this?" And so they all hop in the car, pile in the car. It's Sunday afternoon, right? They drive 3 hours up to come get me. And what they call the rescue mission, you know. Um,
Good
and that
friends.
yeah, very good friends. Two of my buddies from the rowing club. So you know that you make these bonds in life when you get together and you do positive things, right? Um, and so they called it the road trip of a lifetime, you know. and um, you know, my friend Rich likes to joke. He said, you know, you started having a seizure. My dog Jake, this little Jack Russell, is in the back. You know, it's like, yeah, Jake probably jumped on your lap and he's trying to steer the car. You know. So
Wow.
you know, you gotta have fun with the stuff. But that was the point, obviously, where I said, okay, now I'm really gonna look into this ketogenic diet thing, you know. And so that's when I managed to get myself enrolled at a patient as a patient at Johns Hopkins, where they now have an not only a pediatric uh, epilepsy center, which they've had for many years, but they also have a adult epilepsy center as well. And so I managed to get enrolled with patient there with Dr. Mackenzie Cervenka, who does all kinds of research in this field, and she's been terrific. And so yeah, it's been 6 years, 6 years ketogenic, coming up on 3 years seizure free, knock wood, you know. Um, and still, and I always like to qualify too. It's not, I love to say that it's this amazing before and after miraculous thing, but it's a journey, you know. And I'm still on medication as well, you know. But to me, it's, you know, if I can participate in my treatment, if I can have some power over what's going on in my body, then I want to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Then it's meaningful to me. It's very well, like I said, empowering, just being able to say, oh, there's something I can do about this. You know what I mean? And not
Yeah.
just receive treatment or let it happen kind of thing, you know?
Yep. It's such a different thing than the opposite of that, which is like you have to take this pill that's like the opposite of empowering it. It's telling you have to
Exactly.
do something that is outside of your control versus doing something that is inside your control. What an amazing story. And crazy to think that she nearly died. Knowing how smart Jack Russell Terriers are, he probably did try to get up there and steer. I wouldn't put that past a Jack Russell Terrier for sure. Okay, so when was your original diagnosis of epilepsy, and what was that like when that first kind of started? You mentioned, we kind of think of keto as like this fad diet, or you mentioned like with the Abrams story, like they told him like, oh, we don't really do that anymore.
Yeah.
That there is a bit of that in the kind of medical world, especially as it pertains to epilepsy. But what things did they tell you? When was the diagnosis? Like, how did that go?
Yeah, great question. So I had my first seizure at 28 years old. Um, I had before that, I mentioned my auras, and before that, I had one aura when I was at work. Didn't realize what it was. I just thought, oh, that's kind of, maybe I ate something, you know, maybe it's just weird headache, right? Um, but this particular night, I was at the time I was living in New York and in New York City and working as a New York City high school teacher. So one of my roommates was a colleague, one of my fellow teachers, and the other one was, well, he worked on Wall Street. So three guys living in this apartment, and it's a typical, I think it was a Wednesday night. We were kind of sitting around talking about, oh, should we order out for dinner? You know, what are we going to do? Blah, blah, blah. And I sort of had that, like, that lightheadedness, faintness, you know, the weird sort of auditory thing going on. And I stood up. I remember we had one of those. Do you remember the Papasan chairs? Just like a shaped like a satellite dish from
No, I
like
should
Pier
know about
One
that.
or something like
Oh,
that.
yes. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, these funky things. So it was one of those chairs. I stood up to like try to clear my head, you know, try to shake my head or whatever. And that's when I lost consciousness. I fell back into the chair. So thankfully, nice soft landing. And started to have a full on, you know, and my seizures are full on grand mal, you know, the shaking, the loss of consciousness, you know, eyes rolling back in my head, the whole scary thing, right? Um, that's one thing a lot of people don't know. There's dozens of types of seizures, you know. Some people just lose consciousness, some people the brain sort of seizes up, but nothing happens physically. They sort of have to stare out, and what they call an absence seizure. You kind of stare out into the distance. But yeah, mine was the full production. And so my roommates were, obviously freaked out, right? Completely freaked. So one of them calls 911. They're kind of running around, screaming. And we had this neighbor at the time, and he was kind of a doofus, right? We, behind his back, we called him the buffoon. And, and he comes tromping down the hallway. What's going on in here? My roommate goes, buffoon, go out and hail an ambulance. Like, like they're driving around like taxis, right? But anyway, so the EMTs show up, right? And they're doing sort of their check and all their things, right? And the thing is, after a seizure, typically there's what they call a post-ictal period, where you're back to being conscious, but you're kind of really out of it. You know what I mean? So people, they think they get mistaken for being drunk or on drugs or something like that, because they're kind of not making any sense, right? So they sit there and they ask you, what's your name? What day? Do you know what day of the week it is? Do you know who's the president? The guy goes, what did you have for breakfast? And I was like, yogurt. And my roommate's like shaking his head. He's like, he had a bagel and cream cheese. Come on. so but that was my first experience, right? So I wound up, they took me to the hospital, and they ran every test known to man. They did the MRI, they stick you in this big tube and have the magnets banging around your head or whatever. The EEG, where they put a bunch of electrodes on your head to check out your brain waves, and they didn't really find anything, but I have a family history. So my younger brother has had epilepsy since he was a child, right? He had absence seizures, which I mentioned, and then that during sort of his adolescence progressed into grand mal seizures as well. And so they said, well, it does kind of run in families. It's not uncommon for two siblings to have it, right? So they put me on medication, which I was like, okay, fine, that's the procedure. Okay, sure. Didn't really question it. One unusual thing happened, though. They put me on a medication called, I think at the time I was on Dilantin. And they said, okay, you're going to have one of these pills 3 times. It was supposed to be 100 milligrams 3 times a day. Whoever wrote it down, these are the days of the prescription pad, wrote down 300 milligrams 3 times a day.
Oh my goodness.
So by the end of that week, I was completely out of it. Like, I couldn't stay awake all day. I was having these weird dreams of like rainbows and unicorns and things, like these vivid, crazy dreams. So I went into the usual neurologist, not non-hospital neurologist, that they had recommended, and went into her office, and she's like, wait, you're on this? She's like, this seems like a lot. So
like 3 times as much?
Yeah. So she sent me, and sure enough, I was like at toxic levels, right? And so, this is my first experience with the medical system with epilepsy, right?
Nice.
So you can understand how I'm also kind of partial to a non-medical, non-medicinal treatment to this whole thing. But yeah, I was back in the hospital for another day doing the whole detox thing. So it's, again, I'm always open to exploring alternatives, although, as I point out in the book, this is a 100-year-old treatment. I don't even consider this to be alternative medicine, really, in some ways, and that story is really fascinating to me too. So
yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk about that. I do want to ask, when you became diagnosed and medicated in the very beginning, had you already gained weight at that point, or was it the side effect of the medication that was more the weight gain? You hear that story all the time too.
Oh yeah. And and it's funny because often the clinical trials say oh no, it doesn't cause weight gain, but clinical trials run 6 weeks, something like that.
Right,
when you're on this medication for months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, and sure enough, that is when I started to put on some weight right after that. And I've talked to doctors that are like, oh yeah, pretty much anything that's a neurological drug, there's going to be weight gain effect. And the side effects, obviously, they certainly vary, but some of the profiles of the side effects of these drugs are crazy, right? I mean, depression, or weight gain, or hormonal imbalances, or it runs the gamut, right? If you're messing with things in your brain, you're going to mess with other stuff along the way. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Yeah. One of our former clients and somebody I just met at the conference in Las Vegas this weekend, Jen Winkler had epilepsy, and she kind of
Oh
described
yeah.
what it was like. It's like you start out with one medication. When that fails, you switch medications. When that fails, you either switch or add a medication. And it's
Hmm.
like we could have started with something that's arguably way easier for little to no cost with very few side effects. And so maybe this would be a great time to tell that story. I mean, you hear things like, yes, we knew about this 100 years ago. You hear about ancient cultures. I can't even remember which one, but it was like ancient Rome or something, where if you had seizures of a seizure or symptoms of a seizure or something, they would put you in like a dark cave for 2 or 3 days, essentially like intermittently fast you, and you'd come out and be fine. Like you hear that we've known about this for a little while without really maybe knowing the mechanisms or whatever. Why is it that that ended up falling out of favor, and people like, Jim Abrams, excuse me, felt, insane for coming across something that nobody was talking about anymore?
Yeah, yeah. So and you're right. I mean, Hippocrates in the father of modern medicine. He wrote a book called um what was it called? The Divine Disease. Anyway, arguing that it wasn't evil spirits that are causing seizures, but that it actually is a physical thing in the brain, right? And he says in there, fasting is an effective treatment, right? Um, there's a reference in the Bible that um, the disciples are trying to cast the demons out of a child who is falling into the fire and falls into convulsions, and Jesus says this type can only be healed by prayer and fasting. So fasting has been a part of the it's kind of crazy. So fasting has been part of the narrative for a very long time, but of course, how long can you fast, right? um so and on and off again. In the modern era, one of the more colorful characters I came across in the story was a guy named Bernard McFadden. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
I don't know
Um,
if I have.
but so he was a physical culturalist. He called himself around 1900, and this was kind of the first wave of fitness enthusiasm in the United States. Gym culture, if you will, and it came from German immigrants who brought with them the gymnasium, right, or gymnasium, right, and they had this idea that, hey, exercise is good for you, which was kind of novel to us Americans at the time, apparently.
That's right.
um, and so he sort of went all in on this. He was a really interesting character. He believed in walking barefoot even in the winter and the snow. He would pull his hair every day to try to make it thicker and longer. And he started a whole chain of gyms nationwide, a whole chain of health food restaurants. Started a publication which was sort of, I guess if the Oprah magazine was made by a gym bro, it was sort of that. It was like pictures of him flexing and working out and things.
Nice.
But it was super popular. I mean, he was actually like a really wealthy guy. Um, and one of the things, and among his ideas, was fasting was a big thing. Like, for everything from stub toe to epilepsy, which you mentioned, right? And one of his students was a doctor named Hugh Conklin, who was a DO, doctor of osteopathy, and was interested in natural cures and things like that. So Conklin was actually the first person to publish in the literature about fasting as a treatment for epilepsy in the medical literature. And I think he had about 30 subjects in his clinical practice, so sort of case series kind of deal, and talked about how effective it was in children, and about 50-60% of adults responded to the diet. And so again, fasting was in there for a long time, but it wasn't until 1921 that they're able to kind of start to explore why there was this connection between fasting and seizure control. And it was with the discovery of ketones in the urine, right? There wasn't a whole lot of testing they could do back then, right? But one thing they figured out, they can test for ketones in the urine. And that was when a doctor at the Mayo Clinic figured out that, a high fat diet will produce these ketones just like fasting will. And so that was the first, 1921 was the first publication of the ketogenic diet, right? And he was what named it. And at the time it was the protocol, and it's still used today. They call it the classical ketogenic diet, was a 4-to-1 ratio. They talk about it in ratios. So for every 4 ounces of fat, you have 1 ounce of protein and carbohydrates combined. So it ends up being like by macros, it ended up being like 90% fat, basically. And so that, it was published about, it was talked about, it became sort of standard practice. Right up until the mid 50s, I think it's 56, that phenytonin, the first effective seizure drug, was put on the market. And sort of, I talked to Dr. Eric Kossoff at Johns Hopkins about this. Like, is it a conspiracy? Was it the drug companies trying to keep it down, and those kinds of things? And he said, really, the ketogenic diet is a fly on the back of big pharma. It's he doesn't really believe it was a conspiracy, but just the sort of general movement in all of medicine toward pills, toward prescription-based medicine. And so over the years, there's been research. There's about 26 different medications for epilepsy now, but none of them is actually more effective than the ketogenic diet in controlling seizures. That's the crazy thing. Like, they've gotten better, they've gotten fewer side effects, they've gotten better time release administration, all those kinds of things, right? But really, that with the ketogenic diet, if you look at the meta-analyses of, I think 70-80 studies have been done by now over the years, it's about a third of patients are able to achieve total seizure freedom. About a third have a reduction of 50% or greater in seizures, and about a third there's little to no effect at all. But again, that they're still doing just as well as any drug out there. And like you said, if there's something you can do that's natural, that has no side effects, that doesn't have all these crazy chemicals to it, why wouldn't you try it?
Yeah, that's very well explained. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. And so, it is kind of frustrating to me in a way that it does still considered fringe. And again, going back to Jim Abrams, he talks about this all the time. On their website, they have a map of how many diet epilepsy centers are in each state. And I think the highest number is maybe 4 or 5 in California, all of California, right? But in many of them, it's 0. In about half of America, there's no access to this treatment, right?
Wow.
So it's kind of wild. So I was just talking to a friend who has epilepsy as well. And as you mentioned, like, he's been on Depakote for forever, right? And that's one of the older medications, and it's got side effects. So now they add this medication to deal with the depression that comes from the Depakote, and then they add this medication that has to do with the side effects of that medication. It's just this stacking effect, right? Until you're on just like this mess of chemicals of just to try to get through the day. It's crazy.
Yeah. That's crazy. Well, you mentioned Gary Taubes, and I am in the middle of his newest book, Rethinking Diabetes. I'm about halfway through, and he's telling that story, and he's told that story in several of his books. He's like you; he's a great writer, and basically, like, it's kind of along those lines of that type of a story. It's not that anybody conspired to do this. It's that you had a group of people that had to change their diets. They had to be compliant to this diet, or you could eat what normal people eat and take insulin, which we had just discovered at the time. Why not do that? That sounds way better. And nobody had studied long-term effects of giving somebody insulin because they were just starting to do it. So what's the harm? These guys now can eat cake and pie and everything else that everybody else can eat. And it just kind of progressed that way to the point that, chemical mess is a good way to describe it, where you got medications on medications on medications to deal with all the side effects that the original thing tried to treat. So was it this evil thing that happened? Of course, there were bad decisions made, and we didn't follow the science closely enough. But I'm kind of like you. I don't really necessarily believe it was like conspiracy per se.
Right. Yeah. I think even if you look back at the food, and as I've gotten into this, I've gotten interested in the food system and all these things. And if you think about the 50s, it's when they're coming up with Jello and all these sort of miraculous, science. It's like miracle of modern science, kind of Crisco and things like that, that are made in the lab. And of course it's good, it's new, right? There's sort of that modernist thinking around that, right? You could see how maybe it was just swept up in that in this medical community as well.
That's right. Right. And to be fair, like there were problems with the dairy industries and cities and things like that. Like there were some things going on that actually addressed. So yeah, again, interesting to follow that. Let's talk about the science itself and what you've learned about ketones and a ketogenic diet. What is it about a ketogenic diet that can help most people in the realm of like mental disorders, including epilepsy?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And again, as you mentioned, Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing. So not a scientist, nothing medical advice, for the folks out there. But I have gotten really, really fascinated in this. In fact, I just went to the Metabolic Health Summit, which happened in Clearwater a couple of months ago, and just there's so much excitement in the air. I work in the academic community. I've been to lots of conferences in my own field of English, but this one was just it hits different. There's this sense among everybody there that, hey, we're on the cusp of this amazing thing. We're on the cutting edge of this science, and it's just life-changing stuff. And so the most recent book I read, and was just writing about for my blog, a little summary of it, was Chris Palmer's book, Brain Energy. I don't know if you've seen that one, but
So good.
Oh, it's so great. And he describes sort of what, he starts with, okay, why is it that so many epilepsy medications are also used to treat depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, all these different, we sort of compartmentalize, right? We say neurology is over here, psychiatry is over there, right? It's the same organ, we know that, but clearly they have nothing to do with each other, right? So over here we're talking about the chemicals and then the neurotransmitters and things like that in neurology, but over here in psychiatry we're talking about adverse childhood experiences and stuff like that. And he says, well, what if it is all connected, right? What if it really is just about mitochondrial function in the brain, which is basically how the brain makes energy, right? So on the in my book, I really focus mostly on epilepsy, but I did put a couple of chapters about the future of the ketogenic diet and how it's being now explored, just like it has, these applications in epilepsy, but now also they're looking at Alzheimer's, they're looking at dementia, all these things. And with people like Dr. Palmer are looking at its application in things like schizophrenia and depression, bipolar, so it's really exciting time. And the funny thing is, we don't know exactly how it works. There's sort of a number of possible mechanisms. For example, inflammation. We know that the ketogenic diet will lead to less inflammation throughout the body, but also definitely in the brain. So that probably plays a role. We know that the gut microbiome is a big thing. So, if you're on a ketogenic diet, the gut microbiome changes the composition of which bugs are down there and everything. And there's some interesting research that was at that conference where they took, this is kind of gross, but fecal transplants from mice who were, again, they had mice with epilepsy, basically put some on a ketogenic diet, they responded, had the control group, they did fecal transplants where they're taking the microbiome from one mouse and putting it into the other, and they're seeing seizure control even without using the diet. So, there's certainly a lot of things going on there. When I started on it, the sort of base level, my doctor was like, well, the brain really loves ketones, right? If you have, there's a push and a pull sort of thing. So if the brain needs energy, it will pull glucose out of the bloodstream, right? But if there's ketones in the bloodstream, they will push into the brain, right? Rather than the brain having to look for that energy and pull it up. So your brain is actually functioning better. It has more energy available. And that fuel, she said, she called it less excitatory. And that kind of has to do with the neurotransmitters, things like GABA, which are, they call inhibitory neurotransmitter, and glutamine, which is excitatory. So too much of one, too little of another, you're going to have overexcitement in the brain. Basically, it's the neurons are going to start overfiring and get out of control. And so the ketogenic diet seems to keep those in balance better than using glucose as a fuel. Hope that made sense. It was a little bit
That was
rambling.
perfect. No, that was perfect. No, I really appreciate that. And yeah, like we can talk to, researchers and experts in this field to explain it, but I almost appreciate it more when it's coming from somebody who had to go out and learn about it and make it make sense. So I really do appreciate that. I want to go back to your story and this kind of interesting moment where you're discovering a diet for a totally different reason. It looks
Mhm.
like it might be able to help with weight loss. You hear this episode that they are talking about the ketogenic diet for epilepsy. What is that moment like? Like you can eat different versions of a ketogenic diet, but it's in the same like ballpark. Could it possibly be that one diet that is helping you lose weight could also help you with better control of seizures? Like that's pretty incredible. What was that like?
Oh, my mind was totally blown, honestly. And, and the other thing is, again, Jim Abrams is such a passionate guy. I mean, he was literally crying at one point in the interview, just remembering everything they had to go through, right? And it is, I mean, that's one thing about epilepsy is that it's really difficult, not just on you, but on your family, right? My parents worry about me all the time. My wife is worrying about me all the time, um, and it's sort of this thing where there's a I don't know. There's a mystery to it. There's a randomness to it almost, right? Like, I heard one person describe it once as having a stalker. Like, they're out there. You don't know when they're going to show up, right? Are they hiding around the next bush, or you're not going to see them for a couple of days or weeks? Yeah.
Like
Um,
that.
and so, so yeah, so hearing that this thing, right, that I've been sort of dealing with way over here in this little corner of my life, and trying not to think about, right, but that it actually could be connected to what I'm doing over here and trying to get in shape and lose weight and stuff. It's just like, whoa, wait a minute, what, wait, I thought the body was here and the brain was there, right? How is it that it's all the same thing? um Makes total sense when you think about it, of course, right? But of course everything's going to be connected. And so yeah, it's just really, really eye-opening moment to me. Yeah.
It's amazing. And then just all the other pieces that come together, like you start studying evolution and then it makes even more sense. And you start
Right.
studying agriculture and like how the planet works and transportation. Oh, this is actually better for the planet if we do this the
Yeah.
correct way. There's so many layers to it that you peel back, I guess, when you're first learning about it. It just makes it so fascinating. And we do know that there is somewhat of a difference between the type of ketogenic diet we would recommend for somebody with mental health treatments
Right.
versus somebody who is just trying to lose weight. Can you describe what the differences were for you personally?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question, because I mentioned the classical ketogenic diet, which is sort of the most, I guess, extreme, or the most, in fact, and most difficult, of course, because you're weighing and measuring every single thing. But over the years, there's been research about different sort of versions of, even within the epilepsy realm, right? Um, Everything from, so the 3-to-1, the 4-to-1 ratio that I described, then they tried a 3-to-1 ratio, and that seemed to work for most folks. um, there's a version called the MCT oil diet, which liberalizes carbs quite a bit, but you're taking lots of MCT oil, because they've found that if you take MCT oil, it goes sort of directly to the liver, is converted to ketones quickly, and so you'll be in ketosis even if you're not necessarily following those macros. The version that I'm on is called the modified Atkins diet, and that's what they usually use these days with adults, because so it's about 65% fat by calories, right? 65% fat, about 25% protein, and then 5 to 10% carbs. So basically the instructions are try to keep your net carbs under 20 grams per day, and then sort of make sure you're getting enough protein. But um, they actually they encourage you to track at the beginning, so you can kind of see what it looks like. If I have chicken thighs and broccoli sauteed in olive oil, what do those macros work out to be? And that's right, pretty much dead on with the modified Atkins proportions. But then after you kind of get the hang of it, you can kind of move away from tracking every single morsel. you know um and so that's the protocol in adults. They'll use modified Atkins. If it doesn't work, you might go through something a little more strict. Um, but why they call it the modified Atkins is basically they took the Atkins book, and it's basically the induction phase of the Atkins diet. You just stay in that phase, right? So there is some overlap to your question. There is some overlap between the ketogenic diet for weight loss versus for epilepsy. It's just with epilepsy, the stakes are higher, right? The why is a little bit bigger, and so you're going to be a little bit more purposeful about dialing it in as much as you can. Yeah.
We had Nicole Laurent come on our show a few times, but like to say like this will help you lose weight, this will help you lose fat, like that's awesome, that's really great. But once you start to get into the mental health, this is the like, okay, now we're not screwing around anymore. Kind of a ketogenic diet. We're going to be really a lot more precise, like you said. And it's cool that you can kind of start out a little bit more liberal and just know that, okay, if this isn't working, you can always go a little bit more strict, a little bit more strict. The thing I hear a lot of, mostly with kids, some adults, but mostly with kids, is compliance. They have a really, really, really tough time keeping kids on the diet. Yeah, they can control things at home, but if the kids go to a party and they have a piece of cake and they go off, what has been, first of all, your own personal experience? Again, kind of different since yours was diagnosed a lot later. I would guess your motivation and your, agency to be able to control what you're eating played a big part in how you're able to eat. But also what you've noticed in the epilepsy community, like compliance, is that a big issue, or do you tend to find a lot of people are very motivated to eat this way and they can continue eating this way for a very long time?
Yeah, great question. So in the literature, that is comes up again and again. Compliance is the biggest concern, right? Even in clinical trials, it's among those who stuck to it, these are the results, but maybe sometimes almost half of the people don't stick to it. And from my own perspective, it makes sense. I mean, you're doing something that is completely countercultural, right? I mean, especially if you're on a stricter version, it's like, forget about eating out, forget even if unless you really I'm going to have the hamburger bun with cheese and bacon and throw on some extra mayo to make sure I get enough fat and that sort of thing. But it's just you're making decisions every day that goes against the prevailing culture, right? And goes against what we're being told to eat, right? And so I think that's another piece of the compliance. Like, I'll hear, oh, sure, it's good for your brain, but it's going to kill your heart. Okay, that makes no sense, right? Why would nature create a being that one diet's good for your brain, but it's also bad for your heart? When on the surface of it, that makes no sense at all. But yeah, I mean, I still struggle at times. You go to a party and there's absolutely nothing there, and I guess I'm fasting tonight, but family things, something like that, aunt so and so made her special such and such, whatever it might be, right? So it's you have to be really dedicated. I was going to say disciplined, but that goes without saying. You have to be really dedicated to making this a part of your identity almost, and just, I think a lot of it is the mindset, and you have to say, well, this isn't a treat, this is just junk, and this is, carbohydrates are just cheap fillers, and it's beneath me. You have to have almost, Robert Saives talks about that, how vegans have, to their credit, they have this mindset that this is who I am and this is what I do, and this is, animal foods are murder. I disagree, but are these terrible things, right? You almost have to think that way about carbohydrates, right?
Yeah, kind of make your identity. I like that. And so coming back from this conference that I was just at, the Collaborative Science Conference in Las Vegas, hosted by Dave Feldman. He's doing a lot of that research that you're mentioning about cholesterol. I kind of thought that would be like the main focus, and it certainly was. Everybody was there to learn about cholesterol, but I also noticed this other like subgroup. It was like just as much were there about mental health, and I didn't know why I didn't like put it together after being there for like half a day before I realized, like, oh yeah, okay, so these are the people who have to be on very strict ketogenic diets to deal with these, severe mental disorders like bipolar and whatever. And when they do, then they get that cholesterol response. That's why they're so interested in all this cholesterol thing, is because they're being told you can choose between having mental disorders or having your heart blow up. And we are not in a place where we can say definitively that may or may not happen. And so I'll just ask you on a personal level, all things considered, not just the weight loss, how you felt, the epilepsy, everything. If I said that, unfortunately, the research that we're doing on cholesterol is not looking that good, and you might have heart issues by eating this certain way. Does that change what you day to day, what you do and what you eat day to day, or do you accept the risk and continue living this way because of there's so many other benefits?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a
I
great,
stole that from Dr. Baker. I stole this one from Dr. Baker. I know how I would answer it. I know how many people in the room answer it when they get asked, but yeah, I'd love to hear yours.
yeah, yeah. And so I go back to that incident where that car accident where thank God I made it through. And after that I thought, okay, I'm on bonus time, like like this is, I could easily have died there. And now I've, you know, sort of, well, my admin assistant at the time was like, God is saving you for something special, and so it's almost like, this is kind of talking around your question, but it's almost like, okay, well, this thing could definitely kill me, right? This epilepsy thing. And there's something called SUDEP, which is sudden death in epilepsy, where you just start seizing and you can't stop seizing, right?
Wow.
And until you have perished, basically, right?
Wow.
And so that's a real danger and a real thought for anybody living with epilepsy, right? And so if this diet is going to help me avoid that, but it may or may not, cause this other problem with heart, and the more and so I do worry about it, I'd say, and I do try to learn about it as much as I can, LDL and HDL and ratios. But I will say that this is, I talk in stories, but a year ago I was due for my annual blood work with my neurologist. And so it was right around the holidays once again, right? And my wife is from the Philippines, and they have a dish there called lechon belly, which is grilled pork belly, right?
Oh.
So the part of the pig that they make bacon out of, it's just a steak of that, right? And so it's
Perfect.
massively fatty, and it's got the skin still on it, and the skin gets nice and crispy, and you chop it. Oh, it's so good. And then with
That's so good.
lemongrass and spices and stuff. So this is what they do for holidays and celebrations and things like that. So it's New Year's Eve. I said, oh, I'm going to make a lechon belly. I got one from this butcher, and okay, we'll put it together. And it was like a 5 pound, it's like a 5 pound thing. And it's just my wife and I, right? So New Year's Eve, lechon belly for dinner. New Year's Day, lechon belly for breakfast with eggs. New Year's night, lechon belly again. So it was basically 3 days of eating nothing but pig fat. And then the next day I got my cholesterol done. Okay. LDL 120, a little high, but not bad. HDL 95 and triglycerides 46.
Pretty great.
So my doctor's like, whatever you're doing, keep doing it.
Pretty great.
This is like perfect. So
Wow.
okay, maybe I'm not
Yeah.
so worried about this cholesterol stuff after all,
That's excellent. Yeah. And if you understand the lipid energy model that Dave is proposing, those numbers would be very predictable. If you had eaten a
Yeah,
lot of fat in the days before a cholesterol test, I would assume that your LDL cholesterol would not be super high because you're delivering fat through the lymphatic kind of system versus delivering it through VLDL and LDL particles. And so that makes a lot of sense. If you ever want to pass a cholesterol test with flying colors, just eat tons of fat in the days before you go and you'll be fine. That's
exactly.
fantastic. That
Yeah.
that and that sounds amazing. You're gonna have to make that for me one day for sure. I did a pork belly yesterday. It came out way too dry. So you're
Oh,
my guy
okay.
now.
Oh, I got you. I got you, man.
You already answered one of my favorite questions to ask, which is contrast a low carbohydrate conference to another professional conference that you have been to ever. And I've made this argument before that I would submit that regardless of the topic, you get that group of people together, low carbohydrate people together talking about anything. I don't care what it is. I'll bet you feel a difference in the energy with how amazing people feel and all that stuff. That said, again, you've been to other conferences. Tell us the difference. What is it like to go to that type of a conference on your own dime, usually on a weekend,
Yep.
where you're inside all day, where you'd probably rather be on the beach? What is that experience like?
Oh yeah. I mean, but like you said, the energy is incredible. And at this one, so my father lives not far from there, and so I was staying with him, got to spend some family time, drive 15 minutes away, go to the conference, come back. But the second night I had signed up they had a VIP dinner, you could pay a little extra. First of all, the food amazing, right? Huge steak, huge piece of salmon, this cauliflower mash. I was like, wow, I can eat everything here. Usually you go to a conference and you look at the table and it's all a bunch of danishes and crappy
That's right.
coffee. Amazing food, right? Um, People excited. And then they had a bunch of awards. They awarded Mary Newport a Lifetime Achievement Award. It was really, and I've gotten to know her over the years, so it's just amazing to see that. Um, and they had a dance floor, and this is not too uncommon at academic conferences. There's a author, Kenneth Robinson, who writes about education, and he says, if you've ever been to the dance floor at an academic conference, you've had an out of body experience, because there's a bunch of just people standing there swaying awkwardly, looking at the watch. How soon can I get out of here? Wanting to go home so they could write a paper about it. Um, and this one, so they had their awards, they had the presentations, like, okay, we're going to open the dance floor. Boom, everybody just rushed onto the dance floor. It was like packed, person to person, everyone's just dancing, going crazy. The band finished at exactly 11 o'clock. You could tell that that's when their contract ran out, and all of a sudden people just shouted, one more song, one more song. Like, you would never see that at an academic conference anywhere else. And so they didn't, but the DJ put on like one more song for us, and then it was just, it was wild. Like I said, just the energy there is just, it's
So awesome.
palpable. Yeah.
That's so awesome. Wow. And I was just reflecting too on this last one. It's like, if you, I'm sure that kind of concluded the entire conference, but if you went the next day, you probably would have noticed what I noticed. People flew in, there were tons of delays and cancellations and all this stuff. And you look around the day after, a bunch of people traveled in the afternoon after lunch. It's 3 in the afternoon of very technical presentations. Everybody's chill. Everybody's just like
Oh
paying
yeah.
attention and alert, and they are into it. And there's nobody like nodding off or needing a nap. Like, everybody just feels amazing.
Right. Versus everybody. Yeah, exactly. The
So,
typical everyone, the afternoon slump. I've
yep.
presented at conferences before. Oh, I got the 1 o'clock spot. Oh geez, everyone's gonna
Terrible.
be asleep in the audience. But you're right. No, it's here. Everyone, or if they even ate lunch, a lot of them are just fasting straight through and going to the lunchtime presentations. And
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Easy. Oh, that's awesome. Man, David, this has been awesome. I definitely think that you have a remarkable brain. I really appreciate all your work. And I love the way that not only do you cover the science and you explain it, but you do tie in the stories, which makes it really easy for people to understand. So I really appreciate that. Despite you not having a very long career in the NBA, I do appreciate the book and that you were able to come on our show today. Please tell the listeners where they can go to find you, connect with you, and also to buy the book.
Thanks, Casey. Unremarkablebrain.com is sort of my home on the internet. I do a newsletter every week where I just totally free, it's through Substack, if you know the Substack platform. Sometimes it's a review of a study that just came out. Sometimes it's a book that I just read. It's sort of my way of cutting loose and my creative outlet.
It's
So
really
that's
good,
the best.
by the way. I've been
Yeah.
playing around with it all weekend. It's great.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. And so that's, and there's links there to my book, but you can buy it on Amazon, indie books, wherever books are sold. My Unremarkable Brain is again the title of it. And then I don't do a whole lot of social media, but I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all under the D as in David Robinson Writes, as a verb, WRITES. So
Perfect. Okay, that's awesome. We'll link to all of that. Like I said, David, thank you so very much for everything that you've been through and to be able to write the book and to communicate in a way that people can really appreciate and understand and make it funny and entertaining all at the same time is really wonderful. So thank you again for all of your hard work, and thank you for coming on our show today. We really appreciate you.
yeah, thanks for everything, Casey.
Absolutely. It's been an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.